Lean Six Sigma, Module 2, Six Sigma. In this module, we're going to look at the concept of Six Sigma. We're going to answer the question, what is Six Sigma? We're going to look at two types of implementation of Six Sigma, the standard DMAIC Six Sigma and the defined for Six Sigma. We're also going to explain the origins of the title Six Sigma. It has its origins in statistics. Primarily what we're going to focus on is the DMAIC cycle, which is the define, measure, analyze, improve and control methodology. And also what we're going to do is we're going to examine this methodology using a case study. As we covered in Module 1, lean thinking is all about the creation of value. Once you've identified the value as defined by the customer, then your focus is on removing waste in any given process. Waste we defined previously as transport, inventory, motion, movement, waiting, overproduction, overprocessing and defects. Now we're going to focus on another methodology to reduce variation and eliminate defects. This methodology is Six Sigma. Six Sigma uses data and statistical tools to systematically improve processes by reducing variation and by eliminating defects and by implementing sustainable process improvement. There's two aspects to Six Sigma. The traditional Six Sigma, also referred to as DMAIC, is a process by which you use when you're dealing with an existing process that doesn't meet its existing customer requirements. DMAIC stands for define, measure, analyze, improve and control. In some situations where the process either doesn't exist or no matter what you do will never meet the customer requirement, there is a methodology called design for Six Sigma. This methodology is there to define in more detail the customer requirement, then develop a concept, come up with a design, optimize it and verify. When you look at the overall journey, the journey starts with the customer. The journey starts with the customer defining what's actually critical in terms of their quality requirement. Then you look at the process or the product you're trying to improve, and you ask the question, well, does the process already exist? If the answer is yes, then we're going to follow this route here. And we're going to go through the traditional DMAIC, as in define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. If the process doesn't exist, we're going to follow this route. We're going to come up with the concept, we're going to design it, we're going to optimize it, and we're going to verify it. In both cases, what we're going to do is we're going to use the lean principles to identify waste and eliminate waste. So concepts such as 5S, SMAID, process mapping, value stream mapping, etc. We'll be using all of these concepts. Primarily what we're going to do in this module is we're going to focus on the DMAIC process. Define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. The DMAIC process is defined as follows. It's made up of 5 stages. Define, which is all about defining the goals, defining what the customer wants, defining where the particular problems are in the process, or defining where the potential opportunities are for the future. Measure looks at the process. It maps the current process, measures what's currently happening. Analyze uses the data in the previous process to determine the root cause of the defect. Improve identifies the opportunities and the methodologies by which we eliminate the defects. And control makes sure that the process is always in control for the future. As we said previously, the time that you use DMAIC is when you have an existing process, but that existing process does not meet the customer specification. The stages that we're going to focus on are follows. Define the charter, identify what's critical to quality, identify the performance gaps, identify the resources and the timelines. The next phase is measure. So collect the data, make sure whatever collection system we use is appropriate and is correct and is validated. Map the process and also make sure that we map the process in the context of the overall value stream map. The next part of the process is to analyze and understand the root cause. Here we use a concept called cause and effect, and in some cases as well we may have to design some experiments to verify that we have actually found the actual root cause. The next step is the improvement step, where we come up with solutions. In some cases we want to brainstorm solutions, so we're going to talk about a concept called trees. We also want to make sure that whatever solution we develop is actually appropriate and it doesn't actually have failure modes associated with it. So we're going to use a process called failure mode effect analysis. We're also going to use a methodology called a Pew matrix. If you have multiple solutions and multiple options, the Pew matrix helps us identify which is the most appropriate solution based on the criteria. And the last part of the methodology is the control phase. Control phase is about analyzing the data. It's about monitoring the data in the future. It's about defining roles and responsibilities. It's about making the methodology now part of your normal day's work. Just to mention the Design for Six Sigma methodology, or sometimes people refer to it as CDOV. CDOV is 4 stages. First of all, coming up with the concept. The concept is identifying what the goal is, but specifically it is a methodology to identify what the customer is actually requiring. The design is about making a block diagram of what that functional design looks like. Optimize is trying to optimize the design to make sure it meets the customer needs in the future. And verify makes sure the design actually meets the customer requirements, but also it meets the requirements in terms of manufacturability, testability, reliability, maintainability, etc. As outlined previously, where we use this concept is if we're trying to develop a product or a process that doesn't already exist. Or in some cases there is a process there, but no matter how much you optimize it, it will never actually achieve the overall requirements that the customer specifies. The Design for Six Sigma methodology is made up of the following steps. The first part is the concept. Again, it's listening to the voice of the customer. It's defining exactly what are we trying to achieve. We use tools like the Kano model. We also use tools like KJ or affinity diagrams to group similar items based on the customer need. One of the main tools that's used in the concept phase is a tool called Quality Function Deployment or House of Quality. The next phase is the design phase, where we identify critical parameters. We develop a high-level functional map or process map, and then we solve specific problems using trees, and also we make sure that we have taken into account any potential failure modes and potentially either eliminated their failure modes or built in redundancy. The next phase is optimize, where we try and optimize each of the components, the subcomponents of that process, to make sure it's capable for the future. And the last part is verification. So we verify that it meets the customer requirement. We verify that it's manufacturable, that it's reliable, it's testable, it's maintainable, etc. Before we review the methodology of Six Sigma, it's important to identify the origins of the name Six Sigma, and also to identify how Six Sigma is defined as a numerical target for an exceptional process. Every process, no matter what it is, produces a range of outcomes. In some cases, as in a pair of dice, you want the process to be variable. In some cases, for example, a manufacturing process, you want the process to be as tightly controlled as possible. To understand the concept of variation and where the term Six Sigma comes from, let's look at a very simple process of throwing a dice. Let's start off first of all with one die, singular of dice. The probability of throwing a 1 using one die is 1 in 6. The probability of throwing 2 using one die is 1 in 6. The probability of throwing a 6 using one die is 1 in 6. The probability of throwing a 7 using one die is 0. It's not possible. So the first graph in the top left-hand corner, identifies the 6 possible outcomes for this process, and in each one of those cases, the probability is 1 in 6. Let's say, for example, we now have 2 dice, and in this case, what we do is we add the outcomes of both die together. So, for example, when I throw the 2 dice and I get a 1 and a 1, in that case, the outcome is a 2. So my range of possible outcomes will go from a 2 to a 12, 12 being 6 plus 6. The most likely outcome given 2 dice is going to be the number 7. You can have a 6 and a 1, 5 and a 2, 4 and a 3, and the reverse options. So you can see on the graph that 7 has the highest probability, whereas 2 and 12 have the lowest probability. If I now have 3 dice, my range of outputs can go from 3 to 18, and my most probable number is actually going to be 10 and 11. If I have 4 dice, we can see that my lowest option is going to be a 4, my highest option is going to be 24, and in this case, the most probable number is going to be 14. If you observe what's actually happening as we add more dice, the outcome is starting to form into a specific shape. That shape is referred to as a normal distribution. And probability and statistics can define that normal distribution. And that normal distribution will have a mean or an average, which will be pretty much in the middle, and it'll have a variation from the center. So for any given point, there is a variation from its mean. Statistically, this uses a term called standard deviation, or sigma. Obviously, if we are involved in a manufacturing process, we would like a process that has very little variation, as in the green line here, as opposed to a process that has a very wide variation in the orange line. So the ideal scenario would be the better, the tighter the variation, the more likely the more of the product we make meets the customer requirement. Now, customer requirement only becomes relevant when we actually have a customer defined requirement. If a customer has no requirement, then technically any process will actually do. So let's, for example, introduce a process, and let's introduce a defined customer requirement by which the customer wants all of the product to sit within that rectangle. In this diagram, what we're showing is a customer requirement which is defined by a red box. Anything within that red box, the customer will accept. Anything outside that red box, the customer will reject as waste. The output of our process is defined by the blue line that we're identifying here. As we can see, a certain percentage of the output fits within the red box, and a certain percentage fits outside the red box. In this particular situation, 68% of what's produced by this process actually fits within the red area. Therefore, 32% approximately fits outside the red area and is therefore considered waste. Statistically, this is referred to as a plus or minus 1 sigma process. Depending on the process, this would not be ideal because, as we identified, 32% approximately is waste. Let's say, for example, we tighten up the process. On the next slide, what we'll do is we'll keep the red box in exactly the same position. But what we will do is we will reduce in the variation on the blue process output. In this situation, as identified previously, the red box hasn't changed. The process now is much tighter. In this situation, 95.45% of the process fits within the red box. This is obviously a better process than what we looked at on the previous slide, but it still has a level of waste. Statistically, this process is referred to as a plus or minus 2 sigma. Again, if we reduce the variation on the next slide, keeping the red box in exactly the same position, in this situation, 99.73% of the process output fits within the window. This statistically is referred to as a plus or minus 3 sigma. If we reduce the process n even more, and in this case 99.999998% of what we produce fits within the customer window, this is referred to as a plus or minus 6 sigma process. Hence, where the term came from is when Motorola developed the methodology, they wanted to statistically put a number on their definition of an exceptional process. And they came to the conclusion that if their processes demonstrated a plus or minus 6 sigma performance level, they would be exceptionally good. Hence the name Six Sigma, and hence the origin of the methodology. There is a significant amount of statistics which we won't cover in this module associated with Six Sigma and process capability. One of the calculations that can be done is a terminology called CP, which refers to process capability. If a process is operating at 6 sigma, as identified in the red box here, it has a CP of 2, but what's very interesting and more relevant for us at the moment is for every million outputs from that particular process, 3.4 of them are defective. That's obviously a very, very low number. When we looked at 3 sigma earlier on, we looked at a process where 99.7% of the output met the customer requirement. At a first glance, this seems like quite a good process. But statistically, what this means is if you have 1 million outputs, 66,000 of those actually are defects. Obviously, depending on the situation, that could have a very detrimental effect on the process. If we compared a 3 sigma and a 6 sigma process, it's interesting to look at the comparison. And it's interesting to see then why 99.7% performance in some cases is not acceptable. The first example we look at here is if we were in the process of delivering mail around the world. If we were operating at 99.76% performance, it would mean we would lose on average 20,000 articles of mail every hour, as opposed to 7 per hour if we were operating at a 6 sigma process. If we were operating at 3 sigma, it would mean we would have 5,000 incorrect operations per week, plus 200,000 wrong prescriptions per year. Obviously, within the medical environment, this would be totally unacceptable. Within a plus or minus 6 sigma environment, we'd be operating at 1.7 incorrect operations per week, plus 68 wrong prescriptions per year. A few other examples. 3 sigma performance, 2 long or short landings every day, as opposed to 1 long or short landing every 5 years. No electricity for 7 hours per month versus no electricity for 1 hour every 34 years. 1.5 misspelled words per page per book, as opposed to 1 misspelled word per small library. So you can see in some cases here, the performance is very much relative to the situation that you're involved in. Now we know how Six Sigma is used to define a perfect process. We're going to look at the DMAIC methodology. We're going to cover define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And what we'll do is we'll look at each phase as we outlined previously. And the best way to understand this is using a case study. And the case study we're going to look at is a fictitious company that has a particular problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this methodology. Firstly, define what the problem is. Secondly, measure what's actually going on currently. Thirdly, analyze the root cause of the problem. Fourthly, come up with suggestions by which we could improve that problem. And finally, how do we control that such that it'll never come back again? The first part of the methodology is define. Within the define stage, what we're interested in is understanding what does the customer want. This we refer to as the voice of the customer. What are we trying to improve, and specifically why is it important to improve it? If we can't be clear at this stage, it's very, very difficult to understand what the problem actually is, and hence how do we solve the problem. Also in the define phase, we want to understand the scope of the problem. So is this something that is very localized, or is this something that has a much broader scope? It might be useful as well to understand who needs to be involved. What's fundamentally important is to define a set of measures, a set of goals, and a set of targets. Measurement, we'll see later on, tells us exactly where we are, where we want to be. Our goal and our target defines when we want to get there. We also want to define at this stage what resources are required to implement it, and also are there containments that we should want to consider at this stage. A containment is an activity that you would do to make sure that it doesn't have a severe impact on the customer currently, but a containment never actually fixes the root cause of a problem. Coming out of the definition stage, what we will have is a very clear definition of the problem or the opportunity, as well as its background, the reason why it's important on working on it, the indicators that we will use to measure before and afterwards that will reflect that we have a problem and that we've actually improved it, and also a rough outline of the milestones and the timelines associated with the project. A lot of this activity is usually documented in what's known as a project charter. Within a project charter, it defines firstly what's the business opportunity and the problem statement. So what specific sentence do we use to describe currently what's actually wrong? What are our objectives? What are the key deliverables? And what are the expected benefits after we implement the improvement? What are the specifications that are actually critical to the quality as defined by the customer? What containments have we considered? What resources do we need? As in, who's going to sponsor the project? Who's going to lead it? Who are the team members? What are the timelines? Is there a budget involved, etc.? Finally, what should happen at this stage is this proposal should go for approval at a business level. The reason why you would want to do this is you want to make sure, is there a good business benefit for us implementing this improvement? Also, what the project charter does is it avoids project creep, ensures resources are working on activities that add value. What we're obviously trying to minimize here is misunderstanding, where everybody thought that we were working on this part of the project, and in reality that was never part of the scope. If you look at some of these typical objectives that people are asked to achieve on a regular basis: resolve the issue, make the process work better, get the process working, improve the quality, improve the customer service. All of these at first glance seem like reasonable things, but one thing that is fundamentally missing in all of these objectives is a measurement. So currently, what's actually happening and where do you want to be? And when we talk about things like process and get it working or improve the quality, what exactly do we mean? So what's actually missing here is more specific detail. To define any problem or improvement correctly, there's three fundamental measurements that you need. Firstly, what's today's performance? If I looked at the process, if I looked at the piece of equipment today, what level is it performing at? In terms of efficiency, in terms of yield, in terms of time, etc. Then what I want to know is what's my desired performance level? And the last part I want to know is when do I want to be able to achieve that desired performance level? If I don't have any one of these three pieces of information, then it's actually physically impossible for me to define a problem statement correctly. A problem statement is made up of three parts. It has an object, as in something that we're worried about that's not performing at the level we expected. There's something about that object that's non-conforming. There's a deviation, there's a non-conformity. This is the thing that we wish to find the actual root cause. And finally, there is an extent by which this is non-conforming. For example, if we looked at monthly shipment performance for the UK market for July 2013, This is the object, this is the thing that we're actually worried about. If the performance was 89% against the target of 98%, the non-conformance was that it's operating at 89% against the target of 98%. So the extent of it is outside its target by 8%. If any one of those items was missing, it wouldn't clearly define a problem statement. If we just left it as the monthly shipment performance was 89%, full stop, then we wouldn't actually know whether that's good or bad. If we said the monthly shipment performance target was 98%, and we didn't know what our current performance was, again, that doesn't actually tell us the true story. If you look at this situation, and if you got a letter in the post saying this particular vehicle was observed travelling at this particular speed on the M50 in Tallaght, County Dublin on the 25th of the 1st, 2010 at 8:30 on a road specified with a limit of 100 kilometers per hour. If any one of those parameters was missing, or if any one of those parameters was incorrect, legally that problem statement, that summons, would not actually hold up in court. In the same way, when we look at a business problem statement, if it's not defined correctly, it does not make business sense. So the first part around definition is clearly defining the problem, clearly defining the charter, clearly identifying what's critical from a customer perspective, identifying what the performance gap actually is, as in where are we today versus our target, what resources, what timelines broadly do we need to put in place to achieve the performance. To understand this in a bit more detail, what we're now going to do is we're going to look at a case study. And this case study is a fictitious company. And this company in one way is somewhat similar to Argos in that it has a significant amount of products. It has multiple warehouses. It has multiple locations. It doesn't actually manufacture the product itself, but it takes in customer orders. It delivers those orders. And if the orders aren't correct, they have customer complaints. In this particular company, they have a significant problem. And that problem is manifested in the number of customer complaints that it gets in any given month. In this particular graph, I'm showing from August to February. And on the y-axis, what we're actually looking at is the number of complaints in any given month. So we can see that it's ranging from 0 to 300 on the y-axis. We can also see between August and January, the number of complaints that this particular company is getting is somewhere between 200 to 300 complaints in any given month versus a target of 100 complaints. We could try and resolve this problem and look at all of the customer complaints that are out there, but because there's such a broad range of customer complaints, it might make sense to focus in on a specific number of complaints. In this particular graph, what we've actually shown is the different types of customer complaints that this company is experiencing. One type of customer complaint is called incorrect contents. An incorrect content is where a product arrives at the customer site. The product is in good shape, but it is the wrong product. The next type of complaint that it receives is a product that arrives late. It's the correct product, but it arrives too late. The next type of complaint is a complaint called product quality. Again, it's the correct product, but the quality of the product is inferior. They also have shipping damage and then other types of damage. The biggest type of complaint that they get is incorrect contents. So what we're going to do is we're going to narrow our focus just to focus specifically on incorrect contents. It is absolutely reasonable and makes good business sense to reduce the scope of a problem statement to something very specific and something very manageable, as opposed to trying to solve all of the different types of problems which could have multiple root causes and therefore could have multiple solutions. So what we've done is we've redefined our problem statement, and what we're now focusing in on is just the number of incorrect contents over the same period. So we can see between August and January, we are currently achieving somewhere between 100 to 150 complaints specifically for incorrect contents in any given month, against a target of 50. Whether the target of 50 is appropriate or not at this stage is not something of our concern. Later on, we may come back and revisit whether we need to reduce the target. In this particular situation, this company refers or relies on customer referrals for new business. They're obviously going to lose business if they can't meet their existing customer needs. It also costs them a lot of money in terms of excess rework, because every time they ship an incorrect content, they need to pay for the shippage, they need to send out the new product, and they need to rework the existing product. What we're going to do is we're going to use a structured approach to understand the root cause of this particular problem and come up with a set of solutions that will actually eliminate the root cause. So as an exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to define exactly what is the problem statement. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, what is the problem statement? What is the object? What is the non-conformance? And what is the extent? In this particular case, we can define the problem statement is that the Acme mail order company on any given period between August and February has somewhere between 100 and 150 complaints for incorrect contents against a target of 50. The next question we'd ask is, why would we want to improve this? What is the business case for addressing this problem? The business case clearly is the more complaints they have, the more business they're going to lose. Because their business is very much based on referrals, if they get poor referrals, they're obviously going to lose future business. The third question, what would you measure? What's actually a critical to quality parameter that the customer is actually looking for? The obvious thing you would measure here is the number of incorrect contents, and you would measure it before the improvement and after the improvement. You would measure it before the improvement to validate that you genuinely actually have a problem, and you would measure it afterwards to show that whatever solution you implemented did actually solve the problem. The next question we might consider here is, what containment would we put in place prior to looking at the process and prior to coming up with a more sustainable solution? In a lot of cases, people will actually say, well, double check the order before it goes out the door. And then when you ask people, well, what would you check it against? People will say, well, check it against the original order that they got in the warehouse. But the question is, how do you know, is that document actually correct? In this case, the only containment that you could really consider is actually to ring up the order or ring up the customer and re-clarify the order with the customer prior to shipment. It is important to identify or to point out at this stage that a containment does not solve the root cause. What a containment does is purely make sure that it doesn't get worse for the customer. And the last question we should consider here is, who should be involved? Well, in this case, it sounds like everybody from the customer to the process by which they take the orders, to the people who actually pick the product and ship the product, they sound like the people that we do need to get involved in implementing this improvement. Once we've identified broadly the people, the problem statement, the timelines, the methodology, it makes sense to put them into some sort of a simple project plan. And in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at all of the activities versus a defined set of work weeks. At this level, it's a very rough outline because we don't obviously know exactly what the problem is and exactly where the root cause is coming from. But at least it gives us some indication at this level of what level of resources and what level of timing we need to consider. The next phase of the process is the measure phase. In the measure phase, what we're interested in is understanding what is the current process? How do things happen? What is the process flow? How does this process fit into the overall value stream map? What we're interested in is identifying where the problem exists, and sometimes it's very useful to ask where does the problem not exist. We will collect information, data, graphs, tables, process flows, anything that will help us to describe what the current process actually is. It's also very important at this stage to validate the measurement system. Just because we have data, just because somebody has presented data in a graph, doesn't mean to say that data is valid. What's also possible at this stage is to measure process capability. Process capability is beyond the module that we're going to discuss at the moment, but suffice to say it's possible to measure and give a CP or a sigma value for a process. At the end of this measure phase, what we will have is we will have a very clear understanding of the process, how it works, who's involved, where it happens, how often it happens, when something goes wrong, how big is it, etc. It's important to point out at this stage that what we see in life depends very much on what we look at. And as we described previously, we tend to become very much conditioned to see certain things. We see certain things that are there, and sometimes we see things that aren't there. In the picture, and I'm sure you've seen it before, it's a picture depicting two women, a young woman and an old woman. The young woman has a feather in her hair. She has dark hair. She's looking off into the distance. She's also wearing a necklace. The old woman could probably be best described as a witch. She has a big chin, a big nose, dark hair, and again a feather in her cap, and she's looking downwards. Sometimes, like we said, we see certain things, and sometimes we completely miss certain things. The importance of measurement can't be understated. What's important to understand is if we don't measure it, it'll never get managed. If we measure the wrong things, the wrong behavior will get managed. If we measure the right things and support it with the right behaviors, then we have the potential to make the changes that we need. Measurement and measurement systems accuracy is extremely important when we look at any data. If you look at any piece of data, it's really important to ask the following questions. Firstly, is the data accurate? Does it measure and does it agree with the truth? And the way we can do this is we compare it against a gold standard. So for example, if we want to measure an ounce of gold, we can measure it against a standard. If we want to measure a mole of a certain solution, we can measure it against a standard. The next thing when we look at data and measurement, is it repeatable? So if I do the same test over and over again, do I actually get the same result? Same person, same measurement, same tools, do we actually get the same result? Then what's important is that test reproducible. So for example, if we want to do that test in several places or using different equipment, do we actually get the same result? The next thing we need to look at when it comes to measurement, is it stable? So is it stable over time? If we make the measurement in the morning, and if we make the measurement in the afternoon, or we make the measurement in the evening, or if we make the same measurement in a year's time, does it actually give us the same repeatable, accurate measurement? Resolution of measurement is extremely important. If we're trying to measure something down to 3 or 4 decimal places, then the system or the process that we're using has to be capable of measuring to that level of resolution. And the last part we need to look at is the measurement system linear? So if we measure at the bottom part of the scale and measure using the mid part of the scale and measure using the upper part of the scale, does it give us an accurate measurement? One of the key tools that will be used quite a bit in the measure phase is the process mapping tool. Process mapping, as we discussed earlier on, identifies the steps, the people, the activities involved in any process. The process will have a start and a finish, and within that process then you identify What are all of the key steps, activities, documents, processes involved? Process measurement can happen at different levels. So we can have a very high level process map, as in what we identify here as the talent acquisition process. Then what we can do is underneath that we can have a sub-process, which in this case is made up of approval, search requirements, candidate search, qualify, interview, selection, and hire. And underneath that we can have a much more detailed process, identifying all of the individual steps that take place in each one of the activities. We can also include things like who's responsible to actually complete each one of these steps. How long does it take? What resources do they need, etc. Another important tool in the measurement phase is the value stream mapping tool. As discussed previously, the value stream mapping tool identifies the customer requirement, then it identifies how is the controller going to take that request and convert that into a product or a service that the customer is willing to pay for. As previously discussed, the customer is on the top right hand side. They identify their requirement. The controlling or the planning function then takes that requirement. They may need to go to their suppliers to get resources. When those resources arrive at their process, then it goes through a series of steps. At the output of the last step, the product is delivered to the customer. During the measure phase, it's also useful to ask negative questions to gather information on what's happening at the moment. Sometimes this can be very useful to understand what's in scope and also what is covered and what is not covered. So if you ask the question, where does it happen or where does it not happen? Depending on the answer, the problem you may be looking at could be very, very specific to one process or one piece of equipment, or it could be something more systematic or more generic. When does it happen and when does it not happen? If it happens always, or if it only happens during certain times of the day, maybe 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 12 o'clock, which may suggest happening during shift changeover. If it happens during peak periods, for example, or if it happens during lull periods, that helps us to identify the scope. Who's involved? Who's not involved? We ask these questions not to apportion blame, but we ask these questions to understand, is it something specific related to competency, related to capability of certain people? What happens, what does not happen? Sometimes people use language that may not be accurate in describing a problem. For example, somebody says, well, the boiler blew up. Well, did it literally blow up, or did the valve just go? How big is it? How small is it? So it's useful to quantify the size of the problem. How much is involved? How many are involved? And then the negative questions as well. So in summary, negative questions help us to reduce the scope or understand the scope in more detail. Let's return to the case study where we have a particular company that has a customer complaint. What we're going to do over the next few slides is we're going to present some information regarding the processes and the data we've collected. Based on this data, then we're going to start to formulate an idea in our head as regards where could the problem actually be and what potentially could the root cause be. The process in this organization starts as follows. The salesperson takes the information from the customer, and for the purposes of the case study, we are going to assume that there is no ambiguity between the sales rep and the customer. The sales rep calls in the order, then that order is taken at the order entry department. At the order entry department, they type the order into a PC. So if somebody asks for a particular product, in the order entry department, they assign a part number to that particular product. They don't type in the actual product description, but they type in a SKU number, which we'll see later on. They check on their system to see is the part in stock. If the part isn't in stock, what they will do is they will give the order to planning, who will then go off and plan and buy in that product. If the product is in stock, which is the scenario that we're interested in, they will print out the order on an order form. Then they will give copies of that order form to different departments. One of those copies goes to the shipping department. And within the shipping department, the operators pick up the customer order. What they do then is they go into the warehouse, they pull the product from inventory, they keep pulling the order from inventory until such time as they fill the order. Then what they do is they generate an invoice, they pack the product with the invoice, they generate a label, they attach the label, they ship the product, and the process ends. Sometimes when we look at data, it might be useful to ask the question, when does it happen, when does it not happen? In the first graph over here on the left-hand side, we are presenting a graph of incorrect data on a monthly basis from August to January. If we asked ourselves the question, when does the problem happen? As in, when does the incorrect contents exceed the target? Some people would come back and say, well, it happens in September and it happens in December. Therefore, maybe it happens at certain seasonal times, Christmas, kids going back to school, and therefore they make assumptions as regards what the problem and ultimately what the root cause may be. But in reality, if you go back and ask the question again, at what point, at which month, does the number of incorrect contents exceed the target? The answer is every month. Every single month, it exceeds the target of 50. Yes, there are some months where it exceeds the target by more than other months, but in reality, it happens always. If you ask yourself the question, when does the problem not happen? The answer is never, because it's always exceeding the target. Maybe it might be useful, rather than looking at the problem on a monthly basis, if we decided to look at it on a weekly basis, which is what we're doing in the graph in the bottom right-hand corner. In this case, the resolution on the x-axis has now changed from monthly to weekly. The y-axis still measures the number of incorrect contents. Again, if you ask yourself the question, when does the problem happen? The answer is it happens every single week. When does it not happen? The answer is never. So in this case, the data would suggest that whatever is happening is more systematic. It's not something that happens in a particular month or in a particular week of that month. If we looked at the data right down into daily performance, what we would actually see is the same thing. So whatever is happening in this organization is happening on a systematic basis every day of the week. This organization operates across 3 shifts, days, evenings, nights. If we look at the data of number of incorrect contents based on days, evenings, and nights, what we see on days is they have 202 incorrect contents. On evenings, they have 211, and nights 187. If we ask the question, when does the problem happen? The answer again is always. There are some shifts that are slightly higher or lower than others, but in all shifts, there is a significant incidence of number of incorrect contents. This organization also has 3 warehouses, A, B, and C. So if we ask the question, which warehouse do we see number of incorrect contents? The answer again is all of them. 196, 181, and 223 are the number of instances across the 3 warehouses. Again, this would suggest that whatever is happening across all shifts, all warehouses, at all times, which would suggest it is something more systematic. In this particular graph, as I said earlier on, when somebody orders the product, they don't actually type in the product name. They type in a product SKU number. This product SKU number is shown on the x-axis of this particular graph. So an example of a product SKU number is 82862. This is the number that the operator at the order entry department types into the computer. On this particular graph, what we're showing is the SKU numbers on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we're showing the number of incorrect contents. So for example, the way this graph works is if a customer asks for 82862, in this case, if we follow the line, 36% of the time that product was shipped incorrectly. And they got this product instead, 82862. If somebody asks for this product, 82362, 33% of the time they got the product incorrectly, and they got either this product 82862 or 82576. Right down to if somebody asks for this product 82556, 3% of the time they got the product shipped incorrectly, and they either got this product or this product. If you apply the Pareto principle or the 80-20 principle, which says which products would you focus on that would give you the biggest return, the answer would be the first two products, 82862 and 82362, because they equate to 36 plus 33%, which is 69% of the overall problem. So if we could understand the root cause of what's causing these two products to be shipped incorrectly, and if we could solve that problem, we would solve 69% of the problem. What we're going to do now is we're going to reduce the scope of the problem specifically to understand why these two products, 82862 and 82362, are being shipped incorrectly. Also, we said at this stage that when the order is taken at the order entry department, they type the order into a computer, and that order is then printed on an order form and distributed to multiple departments. So when the order is printed, they print the computer copy of the order form. The first copy goes to sales reps, the second copy goes to purchasing, the third copy goes to accounts payable, the fourth copy goes to order entry, and the fifth copy goes to shipping. And this is what the order form looks like. It's a carbon copy form, and on the form it has the quantity, it has the product, as in the product SKU number, 82862 for example, it has the cost, and it has the total number. And on the bottom of the form it has the department or function that uses that copy, the sales, purchasing, accounts, order entry, shipping. So some key questions we might ask ourselves at this stage. Based on the information that we've seen, who's actually involved in the process? Well, it sounds like, or it looks like, the process is primarily the customer, the order entry department, the people who pick the product, the people who ship the product. For the purposes of the case study, let's assume that the supplier who provides the product is actually providing the correct product. Who's not involved? Well, it's really everybody else, anybody who's not involved in that part of the process at this stage. We asked ourselves the question, what are the symptoms when this particular problem happens? Well, the symptoms are the customer actually gets a product that is incorrect. What aren't the symptoms is everything else. When does the problem occur? The problem occurs from what we can see on the data is it happens always. Every day, every shift, every warehouse. When does it not occur? From what we've seen, never. Where does it occur? In this case, where it occurs is really who is the first person that actually sees this problem. The first person who actually sees this problem is actually the customer. Where does it not occur? It does not occur in the warehouse. The root cause may very well occur in the warehouse, but in terms of where the problem actually manifests itself at this stage, it's at the customer site. How big is it? How many? How bad, etc.? All of those things we've looked at previously. So let's do a little exercise. The question really would be, what are some of the main conclusions we can draw based on the data that we've seen? Well, the first conclusion we can draw is that whatever actually happens here, it happens at all times, across all shifts, in all warehouses, with all of the people involved. The second conclusion is we know exactly what the process is. We understand the process. Somebody calls in the order. Somebody in order entry types in the order. They type in the order entry number. They print it out on an order form. That form then goes to multiple departments, one of which is the shipping department, who then go in and pick the product, generate the invoice, and then they ship the product. We also conclude at this stage, because we've made the assumption that the problem is not coming from the supplier. So these are some of the main conclusions we will draw in the measure phase. It's important to point out at this stage that we haven't diagnosed the problem yet. All we know is there are certain areas that we need to look for in more detail as we go into the next phase. The next phase we want to look at in the process is the analyze phase. Up to now we've defined the problem, we've measured, we've collected data. Now what we want to do is, based on the data we've collected, we want to identify the root cause of the problem. We're going to use a tool called a cause and effect diagram. And then we're going to determine what are the potential causes. And then based on the data, we may have to collect more data to verify the root cause of the problem. When we've done this, we will have a very clear relationship between the problem and its suspected causes. We will understand why the problem is actually occurring. We're going to use a tool called a cause and effect diagram. This tool goes under several different names. It's called a cause and effect diagram. It's also called a fishbone diagram because it vaguely looks like a herringbone. It's also called an Ishikawa diagram, and some people refer to it also as the 5 whys. Cause and effect diagram is a graphical technique that lists all of the possible causes of a problem, and then it shows their relationship and how it relates to the actual effect, the effect being the problem itself. The way you construct the cause and effect diagram is as follows. You develop the problem statement on the right-hand side. You add the major cause categories. And the major cause categories can usually be described under 5 or 6 key headings: process, materials, people, environment, equipment, systems. Then what you do is you brainstorm all of the possible causes. For each of the possible causes, then you ask the question, why did that happen? Or a more useful question is, what caused this to happen? This question is asked over and over again until such time as we get to the root cause. The root cause being the originating problem which causes the problem in the first place. We may need to go and collect some more data to verify is this actually genuinely the root cause. And in some cases there may be multiple root causes, or there may be causes that happen in combination with each other to actually cause the problem. A blank cause and effect diagram looks like the following. On the right hand side you have the effect or the problem. The effect could be I have a pain in my head. The effect in our case is 82862 and 82362 are being shipped incorrectly. Each of the high-level causes are identified by these boxes. So these could be people, these could be equipment, these could be systems, these could be environment. And the way it works at a very high level is this high-level cause causes this effect. So you could say that the high-level cause is people related. The high-level cause could be equipment related. The high-level cause could be environmental related. So if we ask ourselves, why did this happen, or what caused this to happen? The cause of this particular situation is caused because of this. Again, if you repeat the question, what caused this to happen? It happened because of this, which happened because of this. So think of the process almost like peeling an onion. On the outside, you have the symptom or the effect. And every time you ask what caused this to happen, you peel back a layer on the onion and you get to another reason. And if you ask what caused this to happen, then you peel back another layer. Let's look at a simple example. Let's say, for example, your car won't start. That's the effect, that's the problem. That could be caused because of people. It could be process related. It could be materials related. It could be environmental related, or it could be equipment related. It could be people related, maybe because the person isn't familiar with the car and doesn't know how to start this particular car. It could be process related because maybe you have to put your foot on the clutch in this case before you can actually start the car. It could be materials related because maybe we put diesel into the car instead of petrol, which happened because there was no marker, which happened because we weren't familiar with the car. Could be environmental related because maybe it was too cold. Let's say, for example, the car didn't start because it was equipment related. And what caused that to happen? Well, what caused it to happen was the battery was flat. Well, if you ask the question, what caused that to happen? In theory, we could say, well, what caused it to happen was the immobilizer was faulty, which caused the battery to be flat, which caused the car not to start. Well, if you asked what caused the immobilizer to be faulty, maybe that happened because it was wired incorrectly. Ask why did that happen? It happened because it was installed by somebody who was new, who wasn't given sufficient training. So ultimately the root cause here is because the training wasn't provided to somebody who was new, they ended up wiring the car incorrectly, which caused the immobilizer to be faulty, which drained the battery, which ultimately caused the car not to start. So the root cause is really down in this area here, and this is the area that we want to focus on, because if we don't focus on this area, for example, if we just charge the battery, we're still going to have the same situation in the future where somebody who's not trained is going to wire an immobilizer incorrectly, which is going to result in a battery becoming flat and ultimately going to cause the problem again for somebody else. So what we've looked at up to now in the case study is that we've looked at what, and the problem specifically we're looking at is incorrect contents. We've looked at how, as in how the customer calls in the order, how the order is picked and shipped. We've looked at which particular products are causing us problems, and we've decided to narrow the scope down to two specific products, 82862 and 82362. We've looked at the who and the where, so we've looked at it by shift and we've looked at it by warehouse. So the one thing we haven't done up to now is understand the why. So again, let's look at a quick exercise in the case study. And based on the data we've actually seen, if we asked ourselves, well, why is it that these two products, 82862 and 82362, are being shipped incorrectly? And what we're going to do is we're going to construct a very simple cause and effect diagram in another application called XMind. So in this application, what I've done is I've set up the problem statement. So 82862 and 82362 are shipped incorrectly. That could happen because of people, process, equipment, materials, environment, management. Well, based on what we've seen, we may think that the problem, one, could be related to process. What could be actually happening here is that the people may be ordering the wrong component. That could be one problem. Maybe there's something wrong with the ordering process. Maybe there's a possibility that people are picking the wrong product. When it comes to people, There's a possibility that people don't understand the process. There's a possibility that people are not trained. Under management, there's a possibility that it could be culture. Maybe the culture in the organization is to tell people to pick things very, very quickly. Maybe the culture is, well, if we don't have the product, send them another product that's similar. So using this technique, what we do is we identify what are all of the possible causes. And then for each one of these, we would ask, well, what caused this to happen? So if people did not understand the process, we would go off and collect more data. First of all, to see how much do they understand, do they not understand? And what is the reason then for them not understanding the process? We may do the same thing around the ordering process. If we think the ordering process is a contributing factor, then we may look at the ordering process in more detail, and we may test the ordering process to see, is this really a contributing factor to the root cause or not? So those are some of the possible causes. What we're going to do at this stage is we're going to look at some of those possible causes and do some very simple experiments. We look at the data from the experiments and then determine, does this feel like it's a contributing factor to the root cause or not? The first possible cause could be related to people and their lack of understanding of the process. Maybe they don't understand the process, maybe they find the process confusing. So what we did is we took 10 process operators working in the shipping department, and we asked them to trace the process flow that they use from the time that they get the order to the time that they pick the product and ship the product out the door. We want to see, is this exactly the process they're going to be using? We want to see, is this exactly the process they're supposed to be using? And do they understand it? So we asked, does the process represent what's currently happening? And also we asked, is the process confusing? When we carried out the experiment, what we found is all of the 10 agreed this was the process they were using. They were all using the correct process. They were all using it consistently. 9 out of the 10 people said the process was not confusing. So the question we need to ask at this stage is, does this feel like it is a major contributing factor to many operators across many warehouses, across many shifts, across a significant period of time? Does this feel like it's a major contributing factor? The answer in this case would be no. The majority of people understand the process, they clearly understand, they're clearly doing the right thing. There is one person in there who is confused, but one person on their own being confused does not explain why the problem is occurring systematically across every shift. The second possible cause could be related to the order form. Maybe it's difficult to read the order form. We took 15 shipping operators and we asked them a very simple question. How difficult is it to read the order form? We collated the data, and the data looks as follows. Approximately 60% of the people said it was very difficult to read the form. Approximately 20% of the people said it was difficult. 10% of the people said it was moderately difficult. Less than 10 said it was easy, right down to 2 or 3% that said it was very easy. So if we asked ourselves the question, does this feel like it's a contributing factor to the reason why people cannot read the form, or does this feel like it's a contributing factor to why these two products are shipped incorrectly? The answer would definitely say yes. We need to be careful at this stage that somebody says the problem here is that people can't read the form. Therefore, the solution to the problem is we redesign the order form. If this is genuinely a contributing factor, we need to understand what is difficult about the form to read before we can make any solution. To understand what's difficult about the form being hard to read, we decided to ask them very specific questions. Some people mentioned that the product numbers were difficult to interpret. We did this by testing a group of 25 people, operators and non-operators, to read a customer order form and interpret scientific numbers and letters on the form. The result is presented in the graph in the center of the page. So in the first case, where somebody had to interpret between a number 8, for example, and the letter B, about 90% of the people made the correct interpretation. If people were asked to interpret between the number 3 and the number 8, in this case, more people actually got it wrong. So approximately 55% of the people got the incorrect interpretation. If we ask somebody to interpret between the number 7 and the number 1, then the majority of people got the correct interpretation. So in this case, we know that the shipping operators feel the form is very difficult to read. And we also see here that a lot of the operators have a big difficulty interpreting between a number 3 and a number 8. Again, somebody may interpret this and say, the root cause here is that people can't interpret between a 3 and an 8. Therefore, the solution should be, let's not use 3s and 8s anymore. The question we need to ask ourselves is, will this genuinely solve the problem? At this stage, the answer has to be no. Until we know for certain, why is it difficult to interpret a 3 and an 8, we won't really understand the root cause. Another possible cause could be that the incorrect part number is being typed in on the order form. So when the customer or the sales rep calls in the order over the phone, the person in the order entry department may actually be typing in the incorrect part number. What we decided to do in this case is we picked 100 orders from the two products 82862 and 82362. These orders we know were shipped incorrectly, and what we asked the customer to do is to call those orders back in again, unknowns to the people in the order entry department. What we were interested in is what percentage of the time did the person type in the correct product number. So for example, if somebody wanted to order a packaging carton which has a product code 82862, what we found is 97% of the time they typed in the correct product number. If somebody ordered clear plastic film, what we found is 98% of the time they typed in the correct product number, which was 82362. So in this case, we have accuracy of 97 and 98%, again, which is a very, very high percentage, which would suggest that the problem here is not at the order entry stage. There are 2% and 3% inaccuracies in here, but those percentages are not significantly large enough to contribute to the overall root cause or the overall problem that we're seeing. So in summary, based on looking at the three possible scenarios, the first one being the packaging process is confusing, we know at this stage that people are using the right process. We know that 90% of them think it's not confusing. We know that people have a big problem reading the order form. Specifically, people have a big problem interpreting between a 3 and an 8 on the shipping copy. We also know when it comes to typing in the correct order and order number, we know that 97% of 82862 and 98% of 82362 are entered correctly. So the question would be then, which area would we want to focus on in more detail? Clearly, the area we would need to focus on in more detail is in the order form. So why is it difficult to interpret between a 3 and an 8 on the shipping copy in the customer form? Well, clearly the conclusion in that case is the people in the shipping department get the 5th copy of a carbon copy. The 5th copy is the bottom copy, and because the print quality is very, very poor, then the order copy that they get causes it to be difficult to interpret between certain numbers. specifically 3s and 8s, which is actually resulting in mispicking and misprocessing of the order. If we wanted to show that data as a cause and effect diagram, it would look like the following. Incorrect contents are being shipped to the customer. This is being caused specifically because orders 82862 and 82362 are being shipped incorrectly. This is being caused because people have a difficulty interpreting a 3 and an 8. This happens because the order forms are difficult to read. This happens because the print-through quality is very poor. This happens specifically because shipping received the 5th copy of the order form. This happened originally because the original process design did not pilot the process. To present the same data as a paragraph as opposed to a cause and effect diagram, it would read like the following. Product 82862 and 82362 are being shipped incorrectly because the order forms are difficult to read and determine the correct order number. This results in the number 8 and the number 3 being misinterpreted on the order within the shipping department. This happens because shipping received the 5th copy of the computer printout, which is printed on carbon paper, and the print-through quality is very poor. This happened originally because the design process did not pilot the order form and determine the correct optimum type of the form order distribution. This happened originally because the order form was designed by the order entry department and had no input from shipping. So in this case, the root cause we can see is related to the fact that the shipping department have the 5th copy. To solve the specific problem that we have in front of us, this is the area that we need to focus on. There's also an important factor here that in future, if we decide to design another process, it is important that we get input and that we simulate that process. Now that we understand the root cause, the next phase in the process is to improve the situation. i.e., how do we come up with a plan to eliminate the root cause of the problem? It might be important to document exactly what are we going to do. It's also important to document exactly what impact does the solution have on the root cause. We also need to monitor the result before and afterwards to make sure that we have actually implemented a solution that eliminates the root cause. And we may develop some sort of a timeline or a schedule to do a pilot and then do a full-scale implementation. The output of the improve phase is a very clear plan which will eliminate the cause of the problem and the situation. When we look at improving a situation, it's very important to consider several things. The corrective action or the solution you're going to implement, first of all, it needs to eliminate the problem. But we also need to be careful that it doesn't compromise some other critical parameter. So for example, safety, cost, time to implement, etc. There may be short-term corrective actions, there may be medium-term corrective actions, and long-term corrective actions that we might want to consider. Because of financial constraints, time constraints, etc., we may decide to implement short-term solutions first, and then at some time in the future implement a long-term solution. It's also important when we look at the solutions to rate them against certain criteria that the customer considers important. The obvious criteria would be, what would the expected improvement be? Well, will it actually solve the problem? Another important criteria may be its ease of implementation. Will it be easy to implement? Cost of implementation might also be important. You might also want to consider, are there potential side effects? So would this solve other problems, or would it potentially create other problems? And are there future implications? So if something happened within the process, what impact does this solution actually have? One tool that's out there to look at solutions is a theory of inventive problem solving, or a process called TRIZ. It was invented by a Russian Secret Service agent by the name of Altshuler. And basically his job with the Russian Secret Service was that he studied patents. And he was very interested to understand, well, why did somebody file a patent for this particular problem? And what he ended up with was a creative problem-solving technique, which was based in science, it was based on data, but it was very much focused on engineering, quality, business applications. And in reality these days, it has applications absolutely everywhere. Altshuler spent his entire life studying hundreds of thousands of patents. And based on the data that he saw, he always wondered, well, what was the particular problem that somebody was trying to solve? What was the contradiction? He came to the conclusion that somebody somewhere has already solved the very specific problem that you have in front of you. And the challenge then, in terms of creativity, is about finding the solution and adapting that to the particular problem you have. If we look at a simple example, if we look at a crane, if we wanted to make the boom on the crane longer without necessarily making the crane unstable, there are certain things we could do. One, we could counterbalance it like any normal crane. So the longer the boom goes, the more weight we add on the other side. We could move the crane, move it closer to where it needs to be. Rather than counterbalancing it, we could hang a balloon or a lighter object off the end of the crane, which would effectively elevate it. So in all of these cases, we're looking at a conflict or a contradiction. And what Altshuler came up with is he ended up with a table of different parameters which he tried to improve. So for example, weight, complexity, volume. And he also then came up with 40 different inventive principles that you can use to try and solve a particular conflict or contradiction. Therefore, the TRIZ process looks like the following. We start off with a specific problem that we're trying to solve. What we do is we identify the problem and we identify what specifically is the contradiction. Based on looking at the concept of TRIZ, TRIZ identifies 40 different inventive principles. What we do is we look at each one of those inventive principles and ask ourselves the question, well, how do they solve that problem using that particular principle? Out of that, we end up with general solutions and generic solutions, which then we ask ourselves the question, well, how would we apply that specifically to the problem that I have? And would this concept actually solve my problem? Let's look at a few examples. Let's say, for example, we want to make a golf club stronger without necessarily making it heavier. So what we're trying to improve is we're trying to improve the strength. But if we improve the strength of it, traditionally the weight of it would get heavier, which is something we don't want to do. So to make the club stronger, one way of doing it is to change the structure, to change the materials used in the golf club. So rather than steel, use titanium, use carbon fiber, for example, change the shape or make the head hollow, but still have the same characteristic. So one of the principles, principle 40, says change from a uniform to a composite material. Another example or another principle that's identified in TRIZ is the principle of turn it the other way around. If you think about the last 125 years in tomato ketchup, the problem we have is ketchup, because it's a viscous liquid, when it resides in a glass bottle, as it starts to get depleted, it becomes more and more difficult to get the tomato ketchup out of the bottle. But one of the principles that TRIZ suggests is turn it the other way around. So if you turn the bottle the other way around, as in upside down, what happens is gravity causes the tomato ketchup to move towards the opening. Traditionally, we would have viewed the opening as being the top. But if we increase the base, then by turning it upside down, the bottle will actually stand upright. Hence, we solve the problem. Another example of turn it the other way around is somewhat of a tragic example, but back in 2010 in SeaWorld in Florida, there was an accident. One of the trainers fell in, was dragged to the bottom of the tank and was actually drowned. Well, if you asked yourself the question, how would you remove a trainer from such a large tank and such a large area? It would take far too long to actually drain the tank and get the trainer out of the pool. The way to solve the problem is in this particular area here, where you can see this white honeycomb effect. This is the area where the trainer potentially interacts with the whale. So if, for example, if they actually fell in this area here, this entire floor will raise up in less than 1 minute, raising everything out of the water, including the whales. Even, for example, if the trainer is caught underneath the whale, each one of these individual sections breaks away, allowing the trainer to fall back into the water. Well, if you ask yourself, where have I come across this concept before? Think of a deep fat fryer where you contain all of the chips and you can literally lift them all out of the hot oil in an instant, as opposed to trying to remove each one of the individual chips in turn. Another example or another principle of TRIZ is the concept of nested loops, or what's also referred to as the Russian doll syndrome. The idea here is we place one object inside another object, to utilize the space that's available. So if you could imagine, for example, trying to store furniture. Furniture traditionally is made up of an awful lot of space. Hence the idea of flat pack furniture. So the idea is they pack it down as flat as possible. And hence it's obviously much easier to store and transport. Tupperware is another example, as we can see in the diagram, where we utilize the idea of storage. Also, if you look at radio antennas, zoom lenses, for example, all of these things are ideas where we utilize the concept of nesting. As identified, Altshuler identified 40 different inventive principles. Each one of these is identified here, and each one of them can be outlined in more detail later on. The first one is to do with segmentation or fragmentation, where you literally break things apart when you need them. So for example, if you look at the space shuttle, when the space shuttle used to operate and it needed to get into orbit, it needed a large amount of fuel and energy to get it up into orbit. When it was there, it didn't need those rockets anymore. So literally those rockets broke away from the space shuttle and came back to Earth on their own. Russian doll syndrome we've talked about. Weight compensation we've talked about. The other way around we've talked about. Pre-compensation, for example, here in number 11. This equates to if you know something is going to happen and there is nothing you can do to solve or stop the problem happening, but is there something you can do to compensate or pre-compensate? Hence an airbag, for example. Number 22, a blessing in disguise. So is there something you can do to convert a bad situation into an opportunity? A good example of this would be Post-it notes. Post-it notes were originally developed by 3M, and where they came from is on one particular shift they produced a batch of glue that didn't stick. So somebody asked a very useful question. Is there an opportunity for this type of glue, and is there a market there? And somebody answered the question yes. Hence the origins of the Post-it note. So the whole idea behind TRIZ is you look at the specific problem you have, convert it into a contradiction, and then use this set of principles to say, could, by applying one of these principles, actually solve my problem? And then what you do is you look at how do I apply that generic principle to the specific problem I have to see if it actually solves it. Once we've identified possible solutions, it's important then to come up with the best possible solution that meets all of the criteria. Sometimes what happens in different departments or different organizations, we come across this concept of not invented here syndrome. And what tends to happen is when somebody comes up with a solution, everybody else feels obliged to come up with all the reasons why that solution will not work, purely because it wasn't their idea. So what we need is a process to rate the solutions based on different criteria as defined by the customer. One of those possible solutions is a matrix called a Pew matrix. And it's a very simple matrix which helps us to identify a series of solutions and then rate those against a set of criteria. So along the horizontal axis, we're going to identify a series of options or a series of solutions. So option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, option 5, etc. So these are all the possible solutions we could look at that would solve the problem. Then what we do is we define what are the criteria that are important to the customer. So criteria 1 right down to criteria 5. So an example of criteria 1 could be ease of implementation, safety, for example, cost. These could all be important criteria. Not every criteria has the same level of importance. So what we do is we identify which criteria are the most important. The most important, we will rate them with a 5. The least important, we will rate them with a 1. Then what we do is we look at each option and we effectively rate each option based on the criteria. So if option 1 rates very poorly for criteria 1, we give it a 1 in this box here. If option 1 rates very highly for criteria 4, we give it a 5. And then what we do is we calculate an overall number based on options, based on importance, based on criteria. So down here we have a number 53, which is calculated as follows. Multiply 1 by 1, add your answer to 3 multiplied by 2, add that to 2 multiplied by 3, add that to 5 multiplied by 4, add that to 4 multiplied by 5. So this calculation takes into account the importance rating and also the rating of that solution. What we do then is we calculate that for each one of the options, and then what we do is we select the highest number. That should give us the best solution based on the criteria and the importance of each one of those criteria. For the purposes of the case study, what we've done is we've identified 5 possible options. So one possible option is just print multiple copies, 5 copies on normal paper. Another option is to rearrange the copies. So give the first one to shipping, and let's say, for example, we're going to give the last one to the salespeople because they don't need it. We're going to install online computers in shipping, so they don't use an order form anymore. They read it directly from a computer. We could change the printer, or what we could do is under each number write out the product description. So in future what people see is they see a number and the description. In terms of criteria, the criteria we've defined is 1, effectiveness, ease of operation, ease of implementation, time to implement, and cost to implement. And we've identified effectiveness as the most important, ease of implementation as being the least important. So in the first case, what we did is we said print multiple copies. Well, how effective would that be? So on a scale of 1 to 5, it would be very effective because each person is actually getting an original copy. How easy would it be to implement? Well, it would be very easy because we would just print 5 copies. Time to implement, we would give it a 4. Cost to implement, we would give it a 4 as well. So in each one of those cases, what we did is we go through the rating scale for each solution and we rate it against each criteria. You can see down on the bottom we have a series of 5 overall numbers. For the purposes of the case study, what we're going to do is we're going to go with solution number 2, which is rearrange the copies and give the first copy to shipping. So what we're doing is the original process had sales got the first copy, purchasing got the second one, accounts got the third, order entry got the fourth, and shipping got the fifth one. We're now going to give the top copy to shipping, and we're going to give sales the bottom copy. There's an obvious question here that you might ask, well, if we're giving sales the bottom copy, surely we're presenting, or all we're doing is transferring the problem. But in this case, sales actually don't need the copy because they already have the tracking on the PC in front of them. So what might be a more elegant solution is not to give that copy to anybody at all. Before we go off and implement the solution, what we might decide to do is some key actions. We may need to decide, well, we need to redraw the form so that it now says the top copy goes to the shipping department. We would need to test the form. We'd need to get the new form printed. We'd need to train people on the new form. We'd introduce it. We need to monitor the results. And we would need to monitor the complaints. And based on the data, then we decide, are we actually going to implement this solution? At any stage during the process, if you've come up with a new solution, it may be very important to look at what are the potential failure modes for this solution. So for example, if you look at any process, where could the process go wrong? And if it does go wrong, how serious would it be? And is there any way I would detect it beforehand? This process is a process called failure mode effect analysis. And it's the study of risk. It's also important to identify it's not about taking risks. It's about understanding where is the risk in your process, and then understanding if this risk happens, how serious would it be? And is there any way I can mitigate against it? Failure mode effect analysis is a structured method for identifying and ranking the significance of various failure modes and their effect on the product or on the customer. Failure mode effect analysis is calculated using a concept called risk priority number, or RPN number. When we look at risk priority number, that's made up of 3 critical components. The first thing we do for each process is we identify what are the potential failure modes. And we ask ourselves, well, if each one of those failure modes happened, how serious would it be? So on a scale of 1 to 10, we rank severity, 1 being not severe to 10 being very, very severe. For each one of those failure modes, we also ask, what is the likelihood or the probability that it will happen? Again, we rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being highly unlikely to 10 being it is inevitable that it's going to happen. The next thing we look at for each one of those failure modes is, what is the likelihood we are going to detect it beforehand, or what control is in place that if it does happen, either it fixes itself or it has no consequence. So the third part of the jigsaw is we look at detection. If it is absolutely detectable beforehand, we give it a 1. If there is no way we're going to detect it beforehand, or if it does happen, there is nothing we can do to control it, then we give it a 9 or a 10. These 3 numbers multiplied together give us what's known as a risk priority number. The higher the risk priority number, the more we then need to focus on reducing that potential failure mode. So as we said previously, severity, occurrence, and detection are the 3 areas we're going to focus on. And we rate each one of these on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being no effect, remote chance of it happening, and almost certain to detect beforehand, to 10 being very serious to people or to equipment, very high chance of it happening, or almost possible to detect or no control in place. Let's look at a simple example. In this case, this is a failure mode effect analysis of the process of receiving a television channel through a cable. So the process we're interested in here is receiving a channel. One of the potential failure modes could be that the signal quality could be very, very poor. The effect that the signal quality is poor is the channel can't be viewed. Then we ask ourselves, how severe would that be? So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely there's no way we can view that or we can't see it, maybe let's give it a rating scale of 7. Then we ask ourselves, what are the potential causes that could happen? So it could be that the cable is damaged. It could be that the cable is congested. It could be that the connection is poor. It could be that there is actually a fault at the television station. So in each one of those cases, we look at the likelihood or the probability that that could happen. So how often does it happen? So the higher the number, the more likely it is. So for example, a cable being damaged may have a high probability. Let's say, for example, if the cable is in the ground and somebody digs it up by accident. So we give that a 7. The cable being congested is a potential cause. We give that a 6. Maybe the connection is poor. We give that a 7. Maybe there is a fault actually at the television station. That's less likely, so we give that a 3. For each one of these items, then we ask ourselves the question, what control is in place to either protect the cable, or if the problem is going to happen, it will be detected beforehand. In the case of the cable being damaged, let's say, for example, we have a protective shield on the cable. So the control we give is we give it a 4. In terms of cable congestion, the only thing we have is that we can measure signal quality. We give that a 4. Connection, for example, the only possible detection or control we have is there is a possible crimping of the connector. We give that a 7. And then TV fault, well, there is no way we can actually probably detect that, so we give that an 8. In each one of these, we multiply the 3 numbers together to give us a risk priority number. So we can see here one of the biggest risks is to do with the connector. It has the highest number. So on this part of the table, what we do is we identify what are the potential actions we can take. So in terms of the cable, maybe we armor plate the cable, or maybe we have 2 cables. We identify who's going to do it, what's the action, and then what is the potential severity in the future, the potential probability, and the potential detectability, and gives us a new priority number. So in that case, we can identify what the potential solution would be, and then we can predict what the future failure mode is going to be. So this is an example of using the failure mode effect analysis concept to identify failure modes in any process. The next part of the improvement phase is where we collect data to confirm that the solution has actually been implemented and the root cause has been eliminated. Based on looking at the data, then we decide whether we're actually going to standardize the solution or not. The output of this part of the process will be an implementation plan. We'll also have confirmation that we've actually impacted the root cause and that the goal for the overall improvement has actually been met. As we identified earlier on, one of the key pieces through any part of this process is measurement. If we didn't measure the problem beforehand, we wouldn't know that we actually had a problem. Therefore, it is extremely important to measure after we've implemented the solution. What we should expect is whatever we're measuring, we should expect to see a change in that performance. And what we should expect to see is the performance is now well within the defined target. Also, when we look at the improve phase, we should measure, are there any unexpected side effects that have happened as a result of the implementation? Some of these side effects could be positive and some of these side effects could be negative. But it is important to understand what these side effects are and understand what the implications are. It is possible that the result we get isn't satisfactory and we don't achieve the target that we were looking for. There's a few possible reasons for this. One, have we implemented the solution properly? Secondly, have we waited long enough to make sure the solution has been in place to take effect? Maybe we need to go back at the solution that we've come up with and reevaluate it based on the criteria. Or maybe we need to go back to the cause analysis phase and reevaluate the root cause. Maybe there's a possibility we've come up with the wrong root cause. If we get the result that we're looking for, then it makes sense to standardize the changes. Going back to our case study, on the left-hand side, what we looked at was incorrect contents based on the problem defined at the very start of the project. Incorrect contents was the biggest contributor to customer complaints. When we look at incorrect contents after the implementation, we now see that incorrect contents is the lowest item on the list, and late arrivals is now the biggest item. This data would suggest that the solution we implemented did address the root cause. When we look at the data on the monthly scale that we used originally, incorrect contents between August and March was well above target. After implementing the solution between March and April, incorrect contents is now way below the target. This data would suggest that we have addressed the root cause. If we take the data up a step higher and look at the number of complaints on a monthly basis, we're now seeing that the number of complaints based on the target is somewhere in the region of 60 to 70 on a monthly basis, which is well below the target of 100 per month. Again, this would suggest that the solution that was implemented has addressed the root cause. The last phase in the DMAIC cycle is the control phase. Control is about communicating, integrating, monitoring the process for the future. It's about standardizing whatever solution we now put in place and make sure that that is part of the normal process forevermore. So what we want to do is we want to modify the process or the system to ensure any improvements we implemented are sustained over time. And the output of it, like we said, is a plan for communicating, for integrating, monitoring the changes. And what's important as well is we have a plan to implement. The first part is around documenting the new process if we've actually changed the old process. So for example, if in our original process, our process consisted of a series of steps and some decisions. If that process is now different and we've changed the number of steps, this needs to be documented and people need to be trained. We also need to define what needs to happen, who needs to do it. We need to communicate. We need to monitor all of those changes. So it's very, very important that it's clear in terms of who's doing all of those activities. One of the most important things in the control phase is monitoring. So how do we monitor the performance in future to make sure the problem doesn't come back? Up to now, the monitoring has been done by the project team. This responsibility needs to change to somebody within the normal day-to-day operation. So what daily, weekly, monthly meeting will now monitor these key parameters and make sure that these parameters are always staying within their control limits. So one of the things you would do in the control phase is identify some key activities. Some of those activities are around communication. So in the terms of the case study, we need to look at, well, who are we going to communicate? So we're going to communicate to the sales reps, to the team, to the shipping department. We also ask the question, what are we going to communicate to them? So we're going to tell them that the number of customer complaints is going to come down. We're going to show them how much money was been saved. We're going to communicate how. So what changes were made, what was actually done. We're going to communicate where. So where are we going to tell people, what meetings, etc.? When are we going to do it, and why are we doing it? What's also important is how do we integrate the new process into the existing process? So who's going to do it? What is the change? How is it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Why is it going to happen? And the third part that's very important is how do we monitor performance in future? So who's actually going to do it? What are they going to do? What data are they going to collect? How are they going to do it? How are they going to review it? Where are they going to do it? When are they going to do it? And why are they going to do it? Also, when we look at the control phase, it's important that we evaluate where are we now and where do we need to go in the future. We need to collect data and documentation to show the effect of the improvement. We literally need to be able to prove that we've made a difference. We need to document the pros and cons that we encountered throughout the project and identify recommendations on how to resolve them in future. We might end up with a summary of any remaining problems and a plan of what needs to be done to address those. What we might need to do is we need to look at the existing gap, the performance gap, and quantify, have we actually made any improvements? We also need to look at, is there still a gap there? Do we need to continue in on focusing in that gap? We might decide to proliferate the findings to other areas. So if we've come up with a good idea to make an improvement, we have an obligation to tell everybody else. We might focus on a new priority with the team, or we might decide to disband the team because the job is done. We should also look at what worked within the team, what worked well, what should we improve in the future. And it's also important to celebrate the success of the team. In the case study, what we found was that incorrect contents was the biggest problem during the initial period. Late arrivals at this stage is now the biggest problem because the number of incorrect contents has been reduced by 86%. So it would make sense at this stage to focus on late arrivals and drive down the complaints to do with late arrivals. One thing that can be very useful as part of this process is a concept called storyboarding. And storyboarding is telling in a very simple way what actually happened during this project, right from the very start of defining the problem statement, as in the number of complaints were averaging 250 per month, which was in excess of the target, which was 150 per month. Then we went on to describe the current situation. What was the process? What was the biggest complaint due to, i.e. incorrect contents? Then specifically, what data did we collect? What was the process that was being used? What was the form that was being used? What was the root cause that we identified? What was the solution? What was the result? What did we do to sustain that result? And who were the team that were involved? So the whole idea behind using a storyboard is to explain in a very simple way what actually happened, how did they solve the problem, and how did they sustain it, and who are the people involved. In this case, the case study, the current team disbanded because incorrect contents was no longer the biggest issue. A new team were put together to focus on late arrivals. This was a different group of people because late arrivals wasn't necessarily related to picking and it wasn't necessarily related to order entry. Also, what happened here is based on productivity improvements, they made a recommendation that in future, rather than using paper, they decided to use a software system to read the customer order in the warehouse directly. So at some point in time in the future, they actually implemented computer terminals in shipping so they could actually see the customer order entry. So in summary, the Six Sigma DMAIC process, first thing we identified is it's a numerical definition of an exceptional process, i.e. Six Sigma. But secondly, it is a 5-step methodology to identify and improve any process. And the 5 steps are define your problem and define your opportunity. Measure what your current performance is against your target and define What is your objective? What do you want to be able to achieve? Measure is all about collecting data, making sure the data you collect is valid. It's about looking at the process. It's about looking at the process and the overall value stream. Based on the data, you identify what the root cause is. In some cases, you may need to design some simple experiments to validate the root cause. Once you know what the root cause is, then you improve the process by brainstorming and coming up with different solutions, and by using concepts, for example, trees, and then making sure that the new concept hasn't presented any new failure modes. The last part is the control phase. How do we then monitor the data in future, identify who is responsible for monitoring and using that process in future, and how do we clearly communicate our performance to everybody who needs to be aware of it?